Father Stephen Freeman used to, well, I don't know if he still promotes, but he used to promote this idea that the Old Testament isn't really talking about real events that actually happened. Rather, a lot of it was just merely allegory and not real history. Whereas the fathers treat the Old Testament as a history text, even though it has allegories, symbolical events. We don't deny this, but it also describes real events that happened in history. So I guess, what are your current thoughts on Father Stephen Freeman? Well, I never had a dispute with him, but Jay is the one that had a dispute.
Yeah, so years ago, this was resulted from, actually a priest was telling me that I should respond to him. So people think I just go around trying to pick fights or something. No, actually there was another priest who was messaging me saying, hey, would you reply to him on his blog on ancient faith? Because he was, it got pretty extreme at one point. This is like 6 years ago. So I don't remember all the details of what his post was, but it was something like, a lot of these Old Testament stories, it was basically like kind of a loose Origenism. I don't mean that he affirms Origen's universalism, but that many of the events recounted in the Old Testament are not historical. And so the discussion got into things like, well, do you think Adam and Eve were historical? Do you think this or that? And the problem with this is that, the New Testament in many, many places speaks and presupposes that these people were actual historical people. The iconography teaches that they were actual historical people. Adam and Eve, right? David, Solomon, right? So, like, the problem is that you open the floodgates when you start saying that, oh, well, we don't have to believe that these are historical events, right? We do. In fact, there's a great quote I always read from St. Cyril of Alexandria. It's in the Genesis, Creation, Early Man text by Father Stephen Rose. Here it is. Here's what St. Cyril says on this. He says, questions in Joshua. Or no, excuse me, that's a previous comment. St. Cyril wrote that you cannot apprehend the scriptures correctly if one attempts to contemplate the spiritual meaning without respecting the actual historical meaning. Quote, those who reject the historical meaning of the God-inspired scriptures as something obsolete are avoiding the ability to comprehend it rightly, according to the proper manner, the things written in them. For indeed, spiritual contemplation is good and is profitable, and it enlightens the eyes of reasoning especially well. It reveals the wisest of things. But whenever some historical events are presented us by Holy Scripture, in that instance, a useful search into the historical meaning is appropriate in order that the God-inspired scriptures might be revealed to be salvific and beneficial to us in every way. That's commentary on Isaiah. So he's specifically talking about the events in Isaiah, right? Old Testament text. And he's saying that you can't deny the historical reality upon which the allegory or upon which the spiritual meaning is predicated. And by the way, he's not the only one that says that. So this idea that you could sacrifice the historical meaning to save a deeper allegorical spiritual meaning, right, at the cost of getting rid of the historical is actually what's denied. And by the way, St. Maximus the Confessor says the exact same thing too. If you have the Athanasian volume, there's an introductory essay written by Father Cosmas. And at the end of that introductory essay, he says that St. Maximus never sacrificed the historical reality for the allegorical or the spiritual. And that's a mistake to do so. In fact, if you look in Galatians 4, Paul makes his allegory on the basis of Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah having been actual people. The allegory would make no sense if they weren't historical people. And so this is the quadriga. This is the four senses of Scripture. The four senses of Scripture are never intended to deny the first sense. In fact, the other three senses are built on the first sense of Scripture, the grammatical historical. That's the basis for the allegorical, the tropological, the anagogical. So it's really odd to me that anybody who, thinking about the historical, because these people always say, well, you don't know the church fathers. The church fathers use symbolism and allegory. Well, they don't even realize that the four senses of Scripture that they're using presuppose the first sense being the literal historical. And that's just standard scholarship on anybody that would talk about the four senses of Scripture. That comes out of the early and Middle Ages, and it's codified in the Middle Ages in the East and the West, by the way. I mean, it's pretty universally used by the Middle Ages, by the East and the West, to speak of the four senses of Scripture. Another point, too, is that, he was Father Freeman in that. Actually, he had written many articles. It wasn't just one. He had written many articles about well, the Old Testament isn't historical. And it was even verging on sort of quasi-Marcionite statements about how, well, this God of the Old Testament, he's kind of mean, and this doesn't make sense that he would operate this way, and telling the angel of the Lord going before the armies of Israel to destroy and cleanse the promised land. Jesus would never do that, you say. So you see the reasoning here. Well, that's Marcionite. And so when I read Irenaeus against heresies, the funny thing is that when I responded, I did 2 videos responding to him back 6 years ago. Irenaeus uses the very examples that he was giving and says that these are historical events. And if you deny these, you would be following Marcion. So I'm not, people got mad at me, like, oh, you're so mean. Who are you to go? I'm only disagreeing with what he's saying in these essays, that I don't see any church fathers teaching this. The only church father I see teaching this is Origen, and Origen's view of sacrifice in the historical reality for the allegory is condemned in the Confession of Saint Sophronius at the Sixth Council explicitly.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to add about St. Cyril is that it's not just commentary on Isaiah. He says this in the introduction to the Glaphyra and the Pentateuch, that the historical sense is what gives foundation to the spiritual sense.
Yep.
So without the historical sense, you don't have the spiritual sense. So that's as strong as an endorsement to and a vindication of the Old Testament being a history book that actually writes about real events that did happen. Now, one can argue, well, some of the events that happened, the whole, some people are interested in the whole like Nephilim discourse and all of that, where they might say, oh, well, it's not just real people that are being warred against. These are actually like, demi-human, there's that interpretation, right? So like you can make that kind of an argument, but what you can't make as an argument is that, oh, well, this hasn't happened. This was just kind of like, it's just supposed to tell us a story, right? And to his credit, right, and obviously we're not like fans of like super big fans of Ancient Faith Radio and all of that, but to his credit, Father Stephen DeYoung does actually defend the history of the Old Testament, right? So for some people that might be interested in that, they might kind of like be encouraged at the very least to see that there's still some people that have a sensible view of Scripture.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing too is that I've read enough of the church fathers over the years to know very well that there are countless quotes. I'm not just quote mining, but I mean with the proper context, where the church fathers do talk about the inspiration and inerrancy of the Scriptures. Even Saint Jerome, but he frequently speaks this way. And so, again, I want to remind people that if you have the fathers of the church, the Athanasium, if you go to pages 45, 46, 47, in Father Cosmas, the famous Maximus scholar, he will sit here and give you an explanation of the 4 senses of Scripture. And he will talk about how the purpose of this is to get you to theoria, to contemplation of the Scriptures and their true meaning, according to St. Maximus, which is ultimately to contemplate the logia of Scripture, which is to point you to Christ. But in this 4 or 5 page section, he explains very clearly that Maximus's notion of moving up, you could say, in the contemplation from the literal historical, right? It's grounded on the literal historical, right? And so there's other mistakes going on too in this, where they will call fundamentalism believing in the grammatical historical sense of the text. That's not what fundamentalism is. Fundamentalism is a movement of Protestant evangelicals in the early 20th century who hammered out 5 basics or fundamentals that they believed in that they wouldn't compromise on. So that's the actual origin of the term fundamentalism. And by the way, the 5 fundamentals are pretty much things that we would agree, like the Trinity, the virgin birth, the deity of Christ. Those are the fundamentals that Protestant fundamentalists stated they believed in when the Protestant churches and the evangelical churches were being heavily liberalized in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So that's what fundamentalism is. That is a question of lack of faith in the Bible and in Revelation. That is different from hermeneutics, which recognizes the 4 senses of Scripture in terms of exegesis. 2 totally different questions. But the people who want to make the religion more palatable to atheists and to evolutionary proponents. Like, they're always interested in conflating these things and acting like fundamentalism has something to do with hermeneutics. Now, it could, because you could have fundamentalists who do stupid exegesis, but those are two different questions. I mean, it's just a fundamental level confusion. And as I understand it, the reason that Father Freeman kind of had a lot of these assumptions, I don't know him, so I've only interacted with him 7 years ago on that blog, and I'm not trying to be mean to him or rude to him. I'm not saying anything bad about him personally. I don't know him, but my understanding was that he had come, I think, from an Anglican background, and a lot of people who come out of Anglicanism or Episcopalianism into Orthodoxy, they're trained in liberal institutions, and then they just come into Orthodoxy thinking, oh, Orthodoxy is like this more mystical version of an older mystical version of Episcopalianism, and I can keep all of my textual liberalism. And it's not. That's not honest with what the church fathers teach about the texts. You will not find church fathers saying that the texts are not historical. I mean, that's severely in the minority. Okay, you might find Nyssa, St. Gregory Nyssa, agreeing in a few places with Origen, but other than St. Gregory Nyssa, no. In fact, a lot of these people lie too. They'll take St. Gregory Palamas, where he talks about places in Genesis 1. They'll say, when he's talking about the creation of the angelic aeon, they'll take that and lie and say that he's saying that Genesis isn't historical. Total nonsense. He's talking about the creation of the angelic realm not being in history because they're created in the spiritual realm. Angels, right? They're not created in time. And so you see how people are crafty and they lie and they say, aha, see, St. Gregory Palamas is denying 6-day creation. And then he turns around and teaches 6-day creation. It's just total dishonesty by these people.
Yeah, definitely. I think the main problem with this kind of like allegorization, because a lot of people think with like they kind of have this dialectical view of like, okay, if you're not if you're not having this symbological view that you're supposed to have, then the opposite is you just take everything at face value and you end up defending indefensible things, and that this is kind of just you
don't like believe in allegory or the spiritual sense, and you think that everything is literal. There's a 1,000-year premillennial kingdom, and you're a dispensationalist. This is just totally silly, right?
It's just unnecessary, right? Both approaches can be wrong, and it doesn't mean that just one extreme being rejected, it doesn't mean that the other extreme must be endorsed, right?
Yeah, it's not like I have to choose between documentary hypothesis, higher critical liberalism, Jesus quest on the one hand, and then over here I have to be John Hagee dispensationalist, 1,000-year kingdom, dragons flying around in space, Seventh-day Adventists. Literally, they act like that's the two choices you have. No,
yeah, and it's similar to kind of like the temptation that people had in the 5th and 6th centuries, where like on the one hand they saw the Monophysite extreme, and then they thought, okay, if you're not going to be Monophysite, you're going to be Nestorian then, right? But Orthodoxy just tells you actually both of these extremes are wrong. There is a proper royal path in this, and that's what I think we must.
Well, I got bad news for the allegorizers to the extreme. And by the way, allegory is a valid 4th sense of Scripture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or 2nd sense, however you list them, it doesn't really matter. If you read the Ouspensky-Losky book on icons, the chapter on hesychia and icon, and particularly the chapter dealing with the energies doctrine and icons. Okay, this whole chapter where St. Gregory Palamas is discussed and how iconography is tied into the essence energy distinction. I got bad news for those people, because Palamas argues that icons are not symbols. Icons are conveying realities. And he argues that everything that you see in an icon is a historical reality. That's his theological argumentation. So unless you want to deny icons, which is ultimately what the Origenist view does, people don't even remember. If you read the Meyendorff text on Byzantine theology, the chapter on monks and humanists, he says that the motivation behind iconoclasm is Platonism and Origenism. Why would Platonism and Origenism be the motivation behind the attack on icons? Very simple. because Origen's presuppositions are the denigration of history and of time. That's why he has a problem with the body. Okay. How could the body be resurrected as it is? The body's, it's not good. It's bad. History is bad. We got to flee from history and from time. Those are prisons. Plato said the body is a tomb. Time is a prison. Okay, that's Gnostic. That's Platonic doctrine. That's not our doctrine, because Jesus stepped into time and he assumed and deified actual human nature, the same body that we have, the same nature that we have. So iconography is an affirmation of the grammatical historical events. Palamas says they are real historical events in icons. And if you say that they're not, you're a Neoplatonist and you're actually condemned by the Seventh Council.